the other key component that we were talking about in terms of achieving and maintaining a healthy weight and getting that proper energy balance that we spoke of earlier is lower fat intake. And the reason for this is because, like I said earlier, a lot of times we don't see the hidden sources of fat in our diet. And not only is high fat linked to things like heart disease, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and also, of course, weight gain and cancer. We want to choose lean proteins, and we can do this by looking into the dairy products that we eat, being sure to choose non-fat or skim milk, consuming low-fat or non-fat cheeses, and low-fat or non-fat yogurts. Some people also prefer to choose dairy alternatives, things like soy milk, rice milk, or almond milk, and their counterpart, yogurts and cheeses. When it comes to meats, you want to try to choose the leanest meat possible: white meat, chicken and turkey, and lean pork. Now, a lot of times people say to me, well, I don't really prefer the white meat as much because it tends to dry out. It's definitely more chewy and not necessarily as appetizing to them. Well, a great way to make sure that your white meat is tender, juicy, and palatable is to marinate it first. So perhaps think about marinating it in some olive oil and some of your favorite spices, and then cooking it, or cooking it more quickly, like in a stir fry, might help to preserve some of the moisture in those meats. Try to consume fish a little bit more often. And I know for some people, they may not be accustomed to eating fish regularly. It might be more of something that you get when you're out at a restaurant, because it's just not something that people are accustomed to cooking themselves. But believe it or not, fish can actually cook more quickly than their meat counterparts. They actually can cook in less time. So if you're preparing a quick and healthy meal for dinner on a weeknight, fish is actually a great option. Things like tilapia or salmon are great. And even if you needed to use a canned version, they have lower sodium versions of, let's say, wild salmon that you can put on top of a salad and find a really great way to sneak in more fish into your diet. And limiting red meat is also important, and it's an important component of a cancer-fighting diet as well. Ideally, I usually tell my patients to limit red meat to less than twice per week. You want to kind of see where you're at and where your goal will be. Some people eat more red meat. They may be used to eating red meat significantly more than that, and I would suggest that you start by making small changes and perhaps reduce it as best you can, ultimately until you can get it to less than twice per week. And there are some people who actually, use red meat more on special occasions or don't eat it at all, and that's great as well. But definitely keep that goal in mind. Red meat actually also has a lot more of the saturated fat that we know is not healthy for our hearts. So I want to give you a little bit more background on how to choose the right types of fats, because we're saying lower fat intake, but one thing we want to make sure is that we don't lower fat intake and omit the right types of fat and the healthy fats that our body need. First off, we want to eat more omega-3 fat. So this comes from things like fish, nuts, seeds, canola oil, flax, and even fish oil supplementation, which, if that is something that you do, just make sure you do so under the guidance and discretion of your physician. Omega-3 fat is important for its anti-inflammatory properties. Really good for heart health and reducing inflammation in your body, which, as I mentioned earlier, inflammation can be a precursor to many chronic diseases. We also want to eat more monounsaturated fats. Monounsaturated fats are the type of fat found in olive oil, and that makes olive oil so famous. They're found in avocados. Canola oil actually also has monounsaturated fat, and also nuts and seeds. So a good source of mono fats is actually almonds. So almonds are a great top to a salad, or let's say a crust, like make almond-crusted chicken or a turkey dish. And they're a great way to kind of sneak in some of these healthy plant fats and avoid more of the unhealthy animal fats. So we want to also be aware of omega-6 fat. Omega-6 fat is a polyunsaturated fat. It's actually also a polyunsaturated fat, similar to how omega-3 is as well. But the reason why we want to eat a little bit less of omega-6 and a little bit more of the omega-3 is that the omega-6 can actually potentially promote inflammation in our body. It's not a hard one to avoid, because a lot of the foods that contain more omega-6 fats are actually processed foods, things that we shouldn't really include in our diet, things like crackers, cookies, chips, baked goods, etc. And as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about red meat, we definitely want to be aware of reducing our saturated fat intake. This comes from things like fast foods, full-fat dairy products, the skin of poultry and meats, and tropical oils, things like palm oil. Interesting to note, you will see palm oil more often on a food label, and the reason for that is that a lot of times when they're saying trans fat free, they're replacing the oil with palm oil. So even though they're reducing the trans fat in that food, it'll contain more saturated fat. Once again, even more important to read that food label and know what's in your food and what you're buying.